We are blessed today to have Russell Riley from the Miller Center at UVA to continue a kind of theme on the presidency, the nature of the presidency. And in particular, today we're going to be talking about an oral history of the presidency in the last 50 years to kind of get behind the things maybe that are written down to the deeper stories. So, Russell, I thought we would just start with kind of an overview to make sure everyone's on the same page of what it is that the oral history program is about, why it was founded, and when it was founded, and so forth.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity to be here. Oral history was really a practice invented in the middle part of the 20th century to help record history that otherwise would not have been recorded in writing. And so it tended to be a sort of bottom-up practice of history. If you wanted to know something about an Italian fishing village, you're unlikely to have a lot of documents about that. And so the practice was invented mainly for the democratic process of recording history from the bottom up, and it eventually came to encompass also political elites, including the presidency. The National Archives got into the business of doing presidential oral history. There was a very well-organized process underway for doing that, a project on President Eisenhower. I had conversations with the guy who organized that. And then with the Kennedy assassination, he was abruptly uprooted and moved over by the National Archives to start doing recording on President Kennedy. The National Archives got out of the business because of cost concerns in the 1970s, and the Miller Center picked that up. And I actually have a video here that you asked me to bring.
Let's go ahead and see this, sort of an introduction to the program.
Right.
I'm grateful that you all have taken interest in the administration. I've had a chance to talk to a good number of those who've already been interviewed by you. They make unanimously favorable recommendations to me to participate freely and without restraint. I think they all enjoyed it.
I've often said that when an interview is going well, there's no place in the world you'd rather be because it's just fascinating. It's like, being in a movie theater watching a movie, except it's interactive.
One thing that always strikes me about our interviews is that we're able to, after even just a few minutes in talking to our interviewees, we can see a trust developing between them and our interview team. And when that happens, we can dig deeply into the facts of a case or maybe something awkward that they've been a part of. When we dig deeply, we also often will unveil a certain amount of emotion and sometimes even sadness.
I had been over in the presiding in the Senate on the 22nd November, and this fellow Stan Kimmett came over and said that your brother had been shot, and I'll get you relief from presiding over the Senate. And then I remember we were talking to Bobby in the afternoon, and he said, it was a hopeless situation. And so we went out, we got on a plane, went out and told my father, which was difficult.
I was part of the team talking with Max Friedersdorf for the Reagan Project. Max was Reagan's director of legislative affairs, but honestly considered to be a pretty minor figure. And then in the middle of the conversation, he gives us this incredible story about Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, visiting President Reagan in the hospital after the assassination attempt. And in that moment, you could see it, these two fierce political rivals, and yet this tenderness and this humanity that can surface when partisanship falls away.
So Tip came down, and he did go in, and it was rather poignant. I stayed in the room, and Mrs. Reagan, I think she slipped out. I don't think she was in there, but Tip got down on his knees next to the bed and said a prayer for the president, and he held his hand and kissed him, and they said a prayer together.
In 2020, we drew on these interviews to create a documentary about the George H.W. Bush foreign policy team. The peaceful end of the Cold War was one of the great diplomatic accomplishments in American history. We wanted to understand how they did that. Those lessons can help guide major diplomatic efforts today.
I, at the outset of the administration, was very careful on German unification. The president never had that notion. And he says, I believe that Germany has earned the right to be accepted as a full democratic partner.
I believe very strongly that he was going to do it whether he got the support of Congress or not, but that he made the rational decision that it would be better if he had the support of Congress, which is why he was asking me this question in late fall, can I do it? And I said, you ain't got the votes.
The reason that the Soviet Union was dissolved was that it was the only way Boris Yeltsin to get Gorbachev out of his job, was to abolish the job. And if that required abolishing the Soviet Union, so be it.
And we were all old friends. We all worked with each other in different capacities. And so we knew each other. And this was really this was a gang of professional killer angels.
The main product of the oral history program, of course, is a transcript. But the work doesn't stop there. We make those records available to researchers worldwide, and because we're so immersed in the material, my colleagues and I are often the first to publish scholarship based on them. So we're not just preserving the conversations, we're reflecting on them and pulling them together and making sense of what they mean. And in that way, we're shaping the first wave of historical understanding that comes from these interviews.
Being a person who was subpoenaed for writing a 4-sentence email the night after Vince Foster's death and appearing before the grand jury, before 2 Senate hearings, I understood, be very careful about what you write down. I think that it was a critical decision to double down and continue the oral histories because of the importance of them, because we were no longer going to have the written records that had historically been there.
My interview as an oral history interviewee covered not only my early days getting to Washington, but also my days working for President Reagan and ultimately for President Bush. Now, reeling forward 20 years later, I've been afforded the opportunity for the last 3 or 4 years to serve as a member of the Governing Council. And I looked at it as an opportunity to hopefully help shape and support the things that the Miller Center has done over 50 years in its efforts to preserve the institution of the presidency and those things that flow from it.
I always come out of these interviews with a sense of hope about our system, a sense of hope about the presidency, and a sense of hope about our constitutional structure.
You recognize Barbara Perry from an earlier.
Yes, yes.
And I'm compelled to thank my wife. I was wringing my hands yesterday over the fact that this would not sync up, and she offered her guidance and help in getting this. So thanks, Monique.
Wonderful. Well, this is a great video and a great introduction to this program. Just sort of to summarize, it appears then that once the funding ended for this kind of work at the National Archives, you all took over to continue it, focusing in on the presidency. You've been collecting oral history on administrations from Carter onward. Although I did notice we didn't see anything from Obama or Trump there, so I want to ask you about that, how much you have on that. One thing that was highlighted in the video that I think maybe we can pull out is, for why this is so important, is it was mentioned that during the Whitewater scandal, that an email with I can't remember how many lines, a couple of lines that this individual wrote down caused her to have to go and testify before Congress several times. And she indicated that this means that people now in administrations are not writing down what's going on as much for fear of it getting out and then having to go and appear before Congress. And, that's a spectacle these days. So nobody would want that. So I imagine this means then that a lot of what is happening in the administration behind the scenes is not written down, it's not being documented. And so your role is then to kind of fill that void. Is that the basic idea?
That's exactly right. I mean, most people would be familiar with the fact that there are no longer Oval Office recordings, for example, right? I mean, after President Nixon got in such hot water, immediately after Alexander Butterfield announced that there was a recording system, that stopped Nixon, and nobody has seen fit to start it because of the vulnerabilities that it created. At the same time, almost nobody keeps diaries anymore because diaries are subpoenable in an investigative climate. And so what has tended to happen, and we hear this over and over again in the interviews, is that the West Wing and the Oval Office in particular has become strictly an oral culture, that the paperwork is no longer being kept or preserved as it had in the past, because the fear is that anything that is reduced to writing can be subject to subpoena either by a congressional committee or by an independent counsel. And so that has the effect cumulatively of impoverishing the historical record over time. Now, as a counterbalance for that, email. And I think one of the things that probably has been happening over the last 15 to 20 years is that email will fill a lot of that void. But there you'll have a problem of a needle in a haystack. I mean, think about the number of emails that you personally generate or receive.
Right.
If you're me, everything, from mortgage companies to political figures wanting action or support. So the real problem with email is that there are just millions and millions of pages of this stuff that have to be reviewed by an archivist before they can be released. And only a very narrow sliver of that will have any historical relevance.
What's your sense in terms of how much people are putting important discussions in email, though? Knowing all of these sorts of things you just mentioned, are people staying away from talking about key issues in email and just sort of the everyday banal stuff, or is it being used for deep discussions?
One of the things that we've discovered over time, you see that we do, both Republicans and Democrats, we're nonpartisan and our interest is institutional, is that every White House has its own culture. And there are some cultures that are more open and porous. There are others that are more closed and disciplined. And so I think some of this is will depend on the particular administration. But the general trend, again, is towards not putting things in writing. Again, because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, there is an investigative climate in Washington, and at least until the current administration, an enduring investigative climate that tends to make people exceedingly careful about putting things in writing. And I can't tell you the number of times in the course of these confidential interviews where people will tell us, don't bother to go look for anything that I have written on this because it doesn't exist.
Wow.
And so the kinds of records that historians have relied on for millennia are no longer being produced by the leaders of the American government because of this fear of investigations. So we try to do the best that we can to compensate.
Yeah. All right. So they're not writing down what's going on, and the way to get at that then is to try to record what is happening in this oral culture. How do you convince people to come and talk to you and really give you the real scoop of what's happening? You mentioned that they're confidential interviews. So can you say some more about the parameters of this?
Sure. Well, again, it varies with each administration.
Right.
We extend invitations to the people at the highest levels of the government, the people normally at the assistant to the president, which is the highest staff level, and cabinet level officials. We try to get presidents and first ladies and vice presidents as well, and we also try to get foreign leaders occasionally to participate. We usually do this with either the active or the tacit endorsement of the president and his library foundation. Those are important. After a president leaves office, they create these foundations to raise money to create their libraries, museums, and so forth that are very legacy oriented. There are some people who are, just interested in making sure that their story is captured by history, and that's sort of pushing on an open door when we go for them. There are others who are very closed and cloistered and don't particularly care to talk. If you get the encouragement of the president, that helps.
Yeah.
We, as you indicated, we conduct all of the interviews under a veil of strict confidentiality. We've been doing this for over 50 years, and I can still report that in that long interval, we haven't had a single violation of those confidences, so that we're now doing interviews on the first Trump presidency, the 45th. That's my principal project now. We have never done a project on a sitting president because the sensitivities and delicacies of talking about a sitting president are pronounced regardless of who that is. And so there is, I think, elevated anxiety in all projects, but probably a bit more elevated in this instance. And we simply have to assure people that our mission is to make sure that our children and grandchildren will understand what happened in your time in office. We're not here to score political points. We're here to help cultivate your story onto the record. And importantly, they control the release of their interviews.
Okay.
So we could get them to sign a release form in advance of the interview. That would be foolish because they would edit themselves into the tape recorder. They'd be very careful about what they say. And what we tell them is, within the confines of this room, the Miller Center is just 10 minutes up the road from here. Within the confines of this room, what you tell us stays vaulted until we get your official legal authorization to release it. And there are still interviews that we've done on President Reagan that haven't seen the light of day because the speakers haven't deemed fit to open them. So we try to create an environment. We love to get them to come to Charlottesville.
Yeah.
We go to Washington.
I saw you were down in College Station for
right?
Robert Gates.
And I've done wonderful travels. I interviewed Havel in Prague and Kim Dae-jung in Seoul, South Korea, and other places. So I love to travel, but I don't particularly like doing interviews in their offices in Washington because it's too familiar. It looks like their regular environment. We like to get them to come to the Miller Center. It's a wonderful setting, much as this is. They normally drive down, right? Either they come down 29 or they go over to Fredericksburg and come through, and they're traveling through battlefields, or they're seeing these historical areas. They're contemplating history when they come in. They come into the Miller Center, which is an antebellum mansion. Pictures of all of the various administrations lining the walls. And it communicates a sort of solemn commitment to history to get them down. And we find what we feel to be a very high level of candor in these interviews because of those ground rules.
Have you faced situations where an individual has not given you permission to release the information and they've died? What happens in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, this gets us a little bit into the weeds, but oral history.
We like weeds here. That's fine.
Oral history law gives ownership of a person's words to the speaker. So it's not like a journalist interview. If Bob Woodward were to walk up to you on the street and start talking with you, you have a pretty good understanding that anything you tell Woodward could show up on the front page of the Washington Post tomorrow. We operate in a different legal environment where oral history law vests ownership in the speaker, and until the speaker conveys ownership, we can't do anything with it. And so they're aware, they're instructed of that. There is disclosure of that to begin with, and then there is a sort of dance of release that occurs after the interview takes place. We give them assurances so that they'll speak candidly. A transcript of the interview is prepared. 3 or 4 months it goes to them, and then we get them to. They're allowed at that point to make edits to the interview if they wish. Some people are very hands-on editorially. If you've ever read a transcript of a spoken conversation, It's awful. None of us speak the way we write, and so there's a tendency on the part of some people to go in and tinker with their spoken language. I tell you, most often what happens is, 2 or 3 times in an interview, somebody will make a catty remark about a colleague, and on reflection, they'll look at it and they'll think, I don't want this to be in the permanent historical record, that I use this expletive about this particular person. And so they'll say,
we won't ask you for any details on that.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the interesting thing, I think, is that quite common in an interview is somebody will ask a question about something delicate, and they'll say, look, I'm going to answer this, but this is probably something I'm going to hold on to or redact later. And then if they look at it after 6 months' time, and they say, well, this isn't so bad after all, and they'll leave it in. And that's just absolute ironclad confirmation that the method works. It gets them to talk about things that they might not if they had to make a decision instantaneously. Right. And part of our job is to get them to talk about things they don't want to talk about, right? I mean, history is not just your successes, but it's also your failures. And so every administration has its downsides. Hardest interviews I ever had to do was with a woman named Betty Curry, who was Bill Clinton's personal secretary, who was central to his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Ms. Curry looks like your aunt. I mean, she's just an unassuming person that you would just see walking down the street, and here you are having to ask her about the most excruciatingly difficult things imaginable, and yet that's a part of our responsibility. Now, you can read the interview online. There were ways that we managed to get around some of this, but fortunately, in most instances, the biggest difficulties occur in the middle of an administration because we tend to follow a chronological order. By that time, you've developed a good rapport with somebody. You spent hours with them. They've come to trust you. They understand that you're not just there to score political points or to deal with the salacious, but to try to get the entire range of their experience captured in an interview. And so, I think we have a pretty good track record. But I will be the first to admit I do books on these interviews. Yeah. I've just completed one on the George W. Bush presidency that will be coming out next year. I'll put a plug in for that. It's just a compilation of interviews. I did one on the Clinton presidency this way. And when I go back and look at the interviews I've conducted, I sometimes pound my fist on the table and think, why in the world did you interrupt her or him here? Something good was about to happen. Or why did you turn the interview away from this and not move? I'm my own worst critic in troubleshooting things after we do them.
So you mentioned just now and before that in some ways you are the front line of history being written here. What are some pieces of information or sort of clarifying learnings that you've had in this process? I don't know how long you've been working on this, Russell, exactly, but things that came out from the oral interviews that you really, I didn't have that sense of this administration at all, or that was not what I was expecting to hear, but helped reframe your understanding.
Yeah. Well, it's a fair question and a good question, and you would think I would have an easy answer for it. and unfortunately, maybe it's because I'm still on my first cup of coffee rather than my second. I don't know that I have a really good answer. I will say that I was around only for the back end of the Carter project, but the thing that strikes me, that project was begun only a month after President Carter left office, and the name will come back to me. The woman who ran his public liaison office arrived here at the Miller Center in February of 1981, and the thing that I find most notable in going back and looking at the Carter interviews as a scholar is how raw they still were about the outcome of the 1980 election. And this was particularly true of the Edward Kennedy challenge. You saw the interview that was done with Senator Kennedy, which was sort of that was a one-off project. Senator Kennedy had become familiar with the interview work of the Miller Center, and when he was getting up in years and had decided at that point that he didn't have a memoir in him, he started considering oral history and did a survey of the places that were doing interview projects and elected my senior colleague James Young, who's since passed away, to do that project. And so this interview with Senator Kennedy was one there. Yeah. But I have now lost my train of thought.
You were talking about the tension between the Kennedy campaign and Carter, the primary.
Thank you. A second cup of coffee, obviously necessary. I'm sure Barbara, my colleague Barbara Perry, when she was here, was probably completely lucid throughout. The rawness of the Kennedy challenge was something that you really that really comes through those interviews. And then in each of the other projects, I mean, there is a sense about learning a lot about the nature of internal leadership of the person who's president. President Clinton, just his capacious mind and memory, his ability to multitask is just fable. There's a story that was told us by the U.S. Trade Representative where she was engaged in extremely delicate and complex negotiations about a trade deal with Japan, and she goes in to brief President Clinton. It was the second time she'd met him, and he is reading a copy of Marcus Aurelius, which he puts down, and then he's doing a crossword puzzle. And she's briefing him while he's doing, and he's playing solitaire, I think, all simultaneously. And she, is looking at the chief of staff, and he said, go ahead. And so she briefs him about 10 or 15 minutes on this complex negotiation. She said, he looks at me after I finished and asked the 2 or 3 most cogent questions you could possibly have asked in that environment, that he was paying perfect attention all the while doing all of these other things. And this was true of many of the interviews that we did.
Did he complete the crossword puzzle?
He did. I don't know whether he cheated or not. I couldn't tell you because, they are known to cheat at golf and cards and other things. But that's a part of the joy of doing the interviews. It's not just the high policy stuff, which you see this from the interviews about President Bush and President Reagan, for example, these complex questions of national security. Much of it is just what is this president like?
Get a sense of their personality.
Absolutely. And I had mentioned this when I was talking the other day, is that there was an article that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote for the Atlantic magazine, I think in 1967, when oral history was still a relatively new process, where he said, this is fantastic. Imagine what our histories would be like if we thought to do this 100 or 200 years ago. Think about the richness of having interviews with Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Nathaniel Hawthorne or these people. And this is what we're able to produce now. And it's meaningful, I think, for us. I hope you found the infomercial at least a little bit interesting. But imagine more 50 or 100 years from now, when people probably couldn't pick George H.W. Bush out of a police lineup or Bill Clinton out of a police lineup, to have this kind of granular detail about their operations. This will be an important source, I think, for them understanding the history of our time.
Yeah, that's great. Russell, let's open it up to questions from the group. What questions do you have? Yes, Richard.
Yeah, you sort of veered off the question of what happens when the interviewee passes away.
Oh, thank you for reminding me.
Their estate or
indeed, that was, and forgive me, that was not. I wasn't dodging the question. I was mentally impaired in dealing with it because ownership is vested, and we're actually dealing with this issue right now. There was a woman who was very close to Senator Kennedy who passed away a week ago, and her state wants to use the contents of her interview in her memorial service coming up in about a week. We can't give them that authorization, but we said, if you still have the transcript, in her effects, if you have a file of that, her words belong to her. You can use those. We're just not authorized to let anybody else use them. So in instances where people pass away, we had this, for example, there was an attorney whose name is Boyden Gray. Boyden Gray was George H.W. Bush's White House counsel, had been a long time associate of Bush. For years, he would not clear his interview. His daughter is a journalist. Almost immediately after his passing, our editorial staff reached out to her. She said, by all means, let's get this done. And the family was extraordinarily attentive, and within a couple of weeks, made a couple of tweaks to things and got back to us, and the interview was open. So
the heirs then inherit authority? Okay.
That's correct. And then they make the decisions. It's complicated. It worked out really well in this instance because of two children and nobody else. It's a little more complicated in the instance with the Kennedys because there was no, I think there's a sister living, but no immediate family, and we can't make judgments about who the estate might go to. So,
yes, okay.
But there are instances where people pass away, and it's a real problem because we can't track down.
Yeah. Bill.
Yeah.
It seems like the presidential libraries have become so intent on being the leaders in keeping what's going on with their president. Don't you come up in competition with them?
That is a really good question and betrays an insight into the environment we're dealing with. Look, for most, and well, I wouldn't say most, for a good portion of the time, I came back in 2000, had been a graduate student at UVA and been at the Miller Center for 5 years and done some work and was away for 10 years and came back. For I would say the majority of that time, we've been working hand in hand with the library foundations. These are the people that raise the money to build the libraries and then create the exhibits and continue ongoing programming there. And so we were working with those library foundations, and that was extremely important because they provide funding. Importantly, we maintain complete editorial control over the projects, whether we were dealing with the Bush Foundation or second Bush Foundation or the Clinton Foundation. Right. But they actually were instrumental in encouraging their people to participate. So when it comes to the legacies of the presidents, I think they understand that if they are perceived as tinkering in any way with the internal dynamics of our work, it undermines the credibility of what they do. And so, importantly, look, the interviews these are friendly exercises, right? Because oral history is, in effect, a friendly exercise generally. The mission is one of building rapport and confidence. Our job is basically to be midwives to history. That doesn't mean we're uncritical. When we get in those interviews with Clinton, we had to ask them about the Lewinsky scandal. With President George W. Bush, we had to ask about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction and about enhanced interrogation techniques. That's a part of our job, and they understand that. But the answers that we get are still from within the family, right? So we're not likely to be getting the same kind of criticism within the confines of an interview that you would if you were to interview the editorial staff of the Washington Post or something, a rapporteur from the United Nations or something like that. So I think they understand that there's a bit of a bargain here, that they want their stories told. They want their people to cooperate because who's going to know better the interiors of an administration than people who worked with a president? But as sort of the price of doing that in a reliable way, they have to allow us to ask those hard questions as well. And the other thing is we try to interview critics also. It doesn't always work as well because, for a Republican project, Democrats aren't going to think, well, this is a very good use of my time. But one of the best interviews that we did for the George W. Bush project was Congressman Dick Gephardt, who was the party leader in the House for most of the time. Fascinating interview, maybe 2 or 3 hours, not Most of these interviews run about 8 to 10 hours, by the way. They're available on the website, all of the released ones. You can go this afternoon and call up the transcripts, not the audio or video. One of the really fascinating things about the Gephardt interview was listening to him talk about what it was like to be in the minority after 9/11 and this sense of this, we're all in this together, that we had to set partisanship aside. This was a manifestation of a rare phenomenon in American politics of opposition partisans rallying to a president in a genuine crisis to make sure that crisis is dealt with. And it's really illuminating in an era today when there are crises that objectively don't look so much like crises. Recall what it was like after 9/11, what your own sensitivities were, even if you weren't somebody who was supportive of George W. Bush, as Dick Gephardt was not. There was a sense that I got to trust you. And I don't think that's quite present today.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. When I see videos like this, my default is to just take them as factual, like what the person's saying, right? How do you guard against folks that are like so committed to their cause that their interview is just full of fiction, just made up stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's a polite way of saying, don't people lie to you? which I get. We're in the church. You're probably trying to be generous and taking a Christian attitude, and politics is not always filled with what I would call a proper Christian understanding of things. But no, of course, people are representing the reality as they experienced it. But as I often tell folks who ask us this in academic settings, we don't, in these interviews, we don't just walk into the room and push the record button and exit and let them just go on about things. A big part of our responsibility is to press. And again, these are friendly interviews. But what this means is that if we hear something that doesn't pass the smell test, and we're reasonably well educated, but we can't know what's going on behind the closed doors of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we're there to probe. And sometimes we have to get a little firmer than other times. Sometimes it gets modestly contentious. Again, the gold standard in doing oral history interviews is to get perfect rapport with somebody, and you don't want to damage rapport by unnecessarily provoking somebody. But we do push back. And one of the things that happens in these interviews is, let's suppose we get a national security advisor who has been out of office for 6 or 7 years and is spending his time lecturing or going on TV. When they come sit down with us, what they soon discover is that we're far more fluent with the overall timeline of that administration than they are, because they don't spend their days immersed in it the same way that we do. I mean, I'm now reliving through the 45th presidency, the first Trump years, and so I probably have a better recall of the sequencing of those years than many of the people who work for President Trump do. And that has an advantageous effect for us because they know, A, that we're trained in that. B, we're hearing from all kinds of people, and they don't know who we're talking to otherwise.
Right.
And so there's this sense that this guy already knows this stuff. I might as well confess, and then we can get it on the record and move on. Yeah. And that's one of our greatest advantages. But the simple matter is, memories fade. You can tell, right? Memories fade. People forget things. You sometimes find yourself relearning something because somebody has written an account that differs from what your own experience is. So if you read the president's memoir, you remember things. So these are all deficiencies in relying on history by memory. But we still think that the advantages can be profound. I think there's a difference between what I think the psychologists call flashbulb memory, which is what happened on 9/11. I mean, the book that I'm doing and the interviews that we got, the stuff on 9/11 is just extraordinary. because, you know, we've got interviews with people who are on the plane. We've got interviews with people who are being run out of White House. The material on the week after 9/11 is terrible. And and working on the book, I thought, why is this stuff so weak? It's because people were spent. They were distracted and spent, and that sort of flashbulb memory that was captured on 9/11 didn't exist.
Yeah,
I'm rambling.
No, you're not. No, that's very helpful. Yes.
Just curious why the transcripts from these oral interviews, these histories, aren't people and therefore influencing their answers.
Why can't they be subpoenaed? The transcripts of
they
oral
can
history.
be. Actually, yeah. I mean, and that this is, but because an administration is out of office, the sensitivities tend to fade away. I mean, nobody. As controversial as Joe Biden's administration was, and as often as the current administration is going after the predecessors, this is really atypical of administrations. Normally, when a president walks out the door, people forget about him, and so it's not that they couldn't be subject to legal proceedings. It's just highly unlikely that they would be. But actually, this is it can be a problem, and there is a famous instance of this. I won't go into it in detail because we're running out of time. But Boston College was doing interviews in Ireland about Northern Ireland, and the interviewers were not terribly well trained, and they kept representing to the people in Northern Ireland that these were completely candid and off limits. What happened, that was untrue, and there were a lot of people who were spilling legally actionable information in these interviews, including stuff that was hostile to Jerry Adams, who we've interviewed twice about presidents, and it was a real legal mess. So when we get to the point where somebody stops us and says, "Look, could this be subpoenaed?" I have to say yes, it could be. We have to rely on you. We also don't have national security clearances, so we have. No, very rarely, because we tend not to be interested in the sorts of things that would create legal vulnerabilities. We're interested in what's the president like? Was he a morning person or not? How did he like to be briefed? Was the first lady involved in this? Was the vice president's staff? Now, again, on things that have been historically delicate, we'll get into them, but they tend not to be things that are legally actionable. They're more things like weapons of mass destruction, and they're politically delicate. And by the way, the answer is, in case you want to know, they all believed really that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Every one of them, because the intelligence community was telling them this. And it's now a part of the received wisdom that people were just manufacturing this and lying. It was an intelligence failure. The head of the intelligence agencies freely confessed in the interviews, it wasn't the White House making mistakes. It was us in the intelligence community. We simply screwed up, and they were acting on our bad guidance. So
interesting. Well, we've come to the end of our time, Russell, but I'm sure you can stay around. And,
I'm happy to.
Yes, and answer. I'm sure there are going to be many questions for you on this. But thank you so much for being with us. Let's give him a round of applause. It's very helpful. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.